Guys, all right, we are going to start our last section of ancient China notes. Whoop, whoop. It's hard to believe we have made it through almost the entire grapes study, right? We have looked at geography, religion, achievements, politics, economics, and now we're going to do social structure. So we've almost finished another ancient civilization, which is crazy. And you guys are hanging in there really well with this online learning. I really appreciate it. Buckle in. We're almost done with ancient China. And then we will move on to something new after that. So this is a two-part series here on social structure. We're going to look at the social classes in ancient China. These are not in place today. These have disappeared. Now, China is one of the only civilizations really that one of the few civilizations that we're going to study that continues into this day. We know Mesopotamia is not, there's no country called Mesopotamia. There is obviously one called China. And there's one for Egypt and one for India. But with ancient China, the social classes that we saw back then are not in place today. It's much more normal, like what we would have in the United States. But we want to study what they looked like back then. I think these are really interesting. I think some of you, if you care, you'll be kind of surprised what their social structure is and how it was set up, because it's not normal. It's not like what you would maybe think. So ancient China, like in Mesopotamia, the people of ancient China were divided into social classes. Now, just like in Mesopotamia, the emperor and his family were not a part of the social pyramid. They weren't a part of this. Now, when we looked at Mesopotamia, we looked at a pyramid shape, right? And we said that the king or the leader, the emperor, whoever it was at that time, was way above the social structure. Same thing here in ancient China. The emperor and his family weren't a part of it because they were the wealthiest and the most respected. Members of the society. So they didn't even fall into the pyramid. They kind of did their own thing outside of the pyramid. Now, whether you agree with that or not is kind of whatever. But a lot of times leaders don't fall into the structure themselves. And that's the case here with ancient China as well. So there were 4 major classes in ancient China. We're going to look at 4 of them. And for each one, we're going to talk about kind of different characteristics of that group. Okay, so the first group that we have are the scholars and the aristocrats. Not the aristocats, the aristocrats. Get it? Aristocats, Disney? Never mind. Okay. So, I need to go outside. So, scholars are those who went to college. So this group tended not to go to college necessarily, but tended to have a higher education. They tended to spend more time doing thinking stuff. They didn't kind of fall into doing any sorts of jobs. They owned large estates in China. So they owned large sections of land. And these sections of land included their houses, and things like that. It also included the farms and things like that. So, now, owning these large estates meant that they owned large and expensive houses and relied on farmers to work their fields. So they relied on the farmers, which are going to come here in a little bit on the social structure. They relied on them to work their fields. Again, we talked about this with economics yesterday, where there was sharecropping involved, where they owned the land, but the farmers would rent from them. They'd work the fields, and then the farmers would keep a portion of the food, and the landowners would get a portion of the food too. It was kind of their way of paying rent. So they had better access to education, and were highly respected in the community. So they had all the money, they had all the education, they had the land, and so because of that, they were highly respected, which is why they're at the top of the social structure, right there underneath the emperor and his family. So here's kind of a picture of that, of like what an estate would look like. So I'll read some kind of the different things that are on here for you. So here it says Chinese farmers lived in small villages made up of several families. They farmed fields outside the city walls. So this is for Chinese farmers. It says villagers built walls and surrounded and protected the town. Foot-pedaled hammers were used to remove grain and rice from their stalks. Peasants planted and cultivated rice plants in large flooded fields. Since horses were more valuable as war animals, farmers used oxen and water buffalo to pull plows and carts. So you can see, like, this would be like the estate that the family would live in, and so the farmers would live kind of along this outside edge here, where they can then go out and farm their section of fields. And you can see how the fields are kind of divided up by these dividers. That's how they knew many farmers could farm a scholar or aristocrat's estate. Because the farmers were so important, they actually fall next on the scale. So you normally wouldn't think that farmers would be so high up. I mean, they're outside working all day. And because of that, like, you'd think they're quote unquote dirty, and so you'd think they would fall lower on the pyramid, but they don't actually. They fall at number 2. So number 2 is for peasant farmers. They made up the majority of the population, which meant the majority of the population were very high on the social scale, which I think is really, really interesting. Normally when you see, and I'm going to draw a little picture here off to the corner, normally when you look at social pyramid or social classes, they're kind of like this, and I'm going to move myself so you can see it better. Actually, let me do this down at the bottom. Maybe I'll have more room down there. Then I'll have to move myself in the corner. Okay, I'm going to do it down here. Pew. A nice little triangle there, right? Normally, they're kind of divided like this. Where, like, this would be like the scholars, and then it would move its way down, okay? Which meant that this lower rung down here normally had the most people in it, but that's not really the case. Here, it's almost like it's small, and then it's like this, like, huge section, and then it's like small and small. It's not even really like a pyramid. It's like a weird stacked, I don't even know. It's like not even makes sense. Okay? But the majority of the social class, the majority of the population fell into this second group. So even saying that it's a social pyramid isn't even really all that accurate. I probably shouldn't even call it that anymore, because it's not really the case. The peasant farmers were responsible for working the land. Working the land that was owned by the aristocrats. See, I'm going to call them aristocrats. They were responsible for working that land. Oh, why can't I erase? Okay, well, we're going to keep moving. Oh, I know what I can do. I can do this. Why have I never done this before? There we go. Look at me being responsible. I'm having a terrible time with this program. Okay. So, the farmers were responsible for paying taxes and worked for the government 1 month out of the year. So for a month, the lead, normally it would be like the father of the house, would go and work for the government. That would include like going out and building roads, maybe participating in building the Great Wall. Farmers would go out and for 1 month they would work for that government and then they would come back. I don't know if they ever received like money for doing that. I would assume probably not. But that was their responsibility, they paid taxes and then they would go work for the government. They also served as soldiers in wartime. So when a war would break out, like for example, when we talked about in the Zhou dynasty with the period of warring states, soldiers or the farmers would become soldiers and then would go out and fight in those wars. When you make up the majority of the population, that just kind of means you have to be the soldiers as well. So that kind of falls into like a twofold thing for the farmers. Erase, erase, erase. And that's where we're actually going to stop for today. We will pick up on Monday with the last checkpoint, which is going to be for the third and fourth social classes in ancient China. I'll see you guys then.